Welcome, George Community Church and YouTube friends. Really glad that you're here with us this morning. We're in Deuteronomy 5, the second half of the chapter today, but first let's pray. Lord, thank you for teaching us that loving our neighbor is second only to loving you. Thank you that you care so much about how we love and treat one another. We appreciate that so much. Please give us eyes and ears to understand and to obey what you teach us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, loving your neighbor, as we talked about, it's that person across the fence, really important. Your neighbor's on either side and behind you and all of that. But more than that, Jesus was asked, who is my neighbor? And he told the whole story about the Good Samaritan, not to find out who your neighbor is, but rather the point of the story was, are you a neighbor to other people? So really it goes beyond our fence. It goes to everybody around us and how we treat people. And I really love how Paul ties this all together in Romans 13, verses 8 to 10. He says, be indebted to no one except to one another in love. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. The commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and any of the other commandments are summed up in this one decree: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to its neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. And in particular, the second part of the Ten Commandments. Last week we were focused on the first four, which dealt mainly with our relationship with the Lord. So loving the Lord, not having any other gods before Him, not committing idolatry or making an idol, not misusing the Lord's name, and then setting aside the Sabbath. And that, again, it's an Old Testament, Old Covenant with Israel idea about the Sabbath day being the Saturday. But the leftover for us, as we learned last week, is the Sabbath for us in Hebrews 4 is really our relationship with Jesus Christ. We've rested from doing our works to try to please Him, and instead we're trusting in what Jesus did for us. So those were the first four commands. Today we're looking at the last 6 commands in the 10 Commandments from Deuteronomy 5. And Paul focuses on those. These commands that have to do with one another more than our relationship with the Lord. And of course, they're to bleed over onto each side. But love is the fulfillment of the law. Wonderful. Wonderful. Have you ever thought about how out of whack our priorities get? Disrespecting parents, hating, lusting, cheating, lying, keeping up with the Joneses. That's not only in America, that's become commonplace worldwide. Everybody struggles with those things, even though they're the opposite of God's command. Do not covet, do not steal, and so forth. It's amazing. By the way, I mentioned last week that Moses' brother Aaron was the first to make an idol right when Moses was receiving the command to don't make idols. And his grandson led a whole tribe in Israel in idolatry. But who is the first person who broke all 10 commandments? It was actually Moses, when he came down from the mountain and he had the tablets and busted them on the ground. Yeah, sorry. So the first command we're going to look at is honor your father and mother. And in our text, let me read that. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that your days may be prolonged and it may go well with you in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Over in Mark chapter 10:19, when Jesus was talking to a rich young man who was seeking to justify himself and was seeking to be to make it into heaven on his own good works, Jesus put that one at the end, which is interesting. Whenever Jesus or Paul quotes something from the Old Testament or Peter or other writers, it's really interesting to see how they choose to order things. And Jesus was selective. He left some things out and he put some things in that were not part of this particular list. So, but he just changed the order here is honor your father and mother. So challenging this man who felt like he was okay before God, challenging him on these commandments and focused on the second half, this loving your neighbor half, this rich young man. So honor your parents. In our passage here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, it adds, as you're commanded. So in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, it gives the same commands. And this one is honor your father and mother. And it tells about your days being prolonged. It may go well with you, but it doesn't say, as the Lord your God commanded you. So our passage here, this is called Deuteronomy, this book, and it means second law. And so some of the law that Moses is repeating that he already gave us in Exodus chapter 20, he's adding some commentary to it. And in this case, he adds just this phrase, as the Lord your God has commanded you. And it's so important, honor your father and mother. Why does that matter so much? Well, it really indicates our hearts toward God. When God gives us parents, as he has, each of us, and he gives us command to honor them and to take care of them, then when we don't honor them, it shows what our hearts are like. Over in Romans chapter 1, verse 30, it's at the end of a list of all kinds of bad things everybody would acknowledge as bad. Malice, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil. The last thing in the list, disobedient to parents. And part of me kind of wants to scoff at that and say, what's that? That minor thing doing in this list of major sins? Well, it's not a minor thing. It's a major thing. It's as we were commanded, honor your father and mother. It's a command from the Lord, and when we dishonor our parents, we are dishonoring them, but also dishonoring the Lord. When we do honor our parents, we claim a promise that it may go well with you and so that you may live long in the earth, on the earth as the Lord has promised. And that's what Ephesians 6:1 talks about. New Testament, all the commands here in this list of 10 commandments are repeated in the New Testament, carried over. You can't say, oh, that's the Old Testament, those are the Jews, we're in a new covenant. No, all of this is new covenant too. Paul says, honor your father and mother, which is the first command with a promise. And I like that. Paul singles that out about how it may go well with you and you may live long in the land. And because Paul brings it in the New Testament, and they're not all living in Israel, and certainly Ephesus was in Turkey and not in Israel, that promise goes beyond just the Jews and goes beyond just that land of Canaan, the promised land. It comes to us in America. We can live long in this land and it can go well with us. 4 ways adult children damage their relationship with God by dishonoring their parents. And these, they overlap a lot, but refuse to let go of our parents' mistakes, judge our parents harshly, refuse to forgive our parents. They all kind of seem like the same thing to me. When we dishonor our parents, we damage our well-being. We won't live long in the land. We won't do well in our lives. And part of that is because later in Deuteronomy chapter 21, now this is an Old Testament versus New Testament thing, that if you have a son, parents who have a son that is stubborn and rebellious and will not obey his father and mother, even when they chastise him, he will not listen to them. Then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown. They shall say, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. So obviously talking about an adult son, not a young child. All the men of the city shall stone him to death. You shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear. So back in that Old Testament, back at that time, somebody who dishonored their elderly parents was to be put to death. Well, that's a way that you can live long in the land, is to not be put to death by your parents because you were dishonoring them. Proverbs 19:18 gives the other side and says, discipline your child diligently, and don't be a willing participant in his death. Now, how can you square that with this one? Well, if you focus on the disciplining of your child, then there will not be the occasion, hopefully, later in life, for you to have to give that testimony to people that your son is a glutton and lazy and dishonoring and disrespectful. Claim a promise of living long in the land and it going well with you as you honor your parents. Well, to what age? Clearly, this command was given to people who themselves were adults and whose parents were obviously older than that. There's not a cutoff. It never says in the Bible, okay, you have to honor them until they're 50 or until they're 60 or until they're 100. You keep on honoring them. Even as you get up there in age, and if you're a 90-year-old man and you got a 115-year-old mother, then you still honor her. It doesn't matter. And that last picture I had up there were a couple of 100-year-old people. She looks not a day older than 70, actually. So, but whatever their age, you need to keep honoring those parents. Let's read this together. This is from James chapter 2, verse 10 and following. Whoever keeps the whole law but stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. Now, I gathered those two commands together. They are number 6 and 7 in our list in Deuteronomy 5. Murder and adultery. And it's interesting to me that James did the same thing. He gathered those two commands together. He switched the order from the way they were presented here in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. But murder and adultery. And sometimes some people will do that in our culture. They'll say, well, I'm not as bad as, usually they say Hitler, but I'm not as bad as some people. I haven't killed anybody, so I'm okay. I ought to go to heaven. Meanwhile, that person is an adulterer. James is saying, if you keep one, but you break the other, you're a lawbreaker. You don't have a leg to stand on if you say, I'm going to just keep some of them. And Jesus makes the commands harder. Sometimes we have a wrong opinion about what Jesus does. We think that Jesus came to make things easier for us. And that's not true. Jesus actually came to make things harder. He came to fulfill the law and to bring it down to the heart level, and then to be the person who fulfilled those things so that our satisfying God with our behavior is not about us satisfying God with our behavior, but rather saying, I trust in Jesus Christ. Jesus is the fulfillment. Jesus is the sacrifice. Jesus is the payer of the penalty for my sins. Jesus says in Matthew 5:21 that you've heard it said, do not murder. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother is liable before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you're a good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. You guys ever heard anybody call somebody a fool? Or maybe that word has escaped your lips? Look at what Jesus said. That somebody who's calling names and being angry is actually committing murder in their hearts. Rose and I have been watching The Mandalorian on whatever station that is. And I like what Yoda says from a long time ago. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Okay, I like the part in the middle, actually. Anger leads to hate. And that's what Jesus was talking about. What you have inside your heart is what's going to come out, either in your words or, God forbid, actual murder. Proverbs 19:19 warns against trying to rescue an angry man, because if you rescue him, you'll only have to do it again. Somebody who is not willing to give up anger has a big problem with God and has a big problem with other people, obviously. And it's just going to keep on coming. God also disapproves of those who love violence. And so there's something interesting that happens in Christian circles. I myself have said this sometimes. Be choosing whether to watch a movie or not, and then see the rating, and then you say, oh, it's that rating because of violence, not because of sex. And you go, oh, okay, well, let's do that. Let's watch it because of the violence. Well, God disapproves of violence. Remember when Noah tells us in Genesis that the earth was filled with violence. And that's why God sent the flood. The inclination of man's heart was only evil continually. It wasn't just the sexual sin, it was also the violence, the murder that was taking place that brought God's judgment on the world. So we shouldn't be approving of some sins and disapproving of others. We should be disapproving of all of those sins. And Jesus does something similar as he did with anger or murder as he does with adultery here. He says, you have heard it said, you will not commit adultery. You shall not. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Can you imagine this? Anytime you're really tempted to look at something you're not supposed to look at, there's actually a little demon holding your eyelid open so you can't avoid looking at it. And I like picking pictures from the Brick Testament sometimes. So there's a picture later that explains it better. But when this man looked at a different Lego woman with lust in his heart, his wife killed him. Adulterer, and she wasn't right to murder him, and he wasn't right to lust after somebody else. They're both sins. Neither one of them belong in the life of anybody, especially somebody who is a follower of God. Do we go along with the crowd? I was thinking about just these two sins: murder, anger, violence, and adultery and lust and porn. Huge industries in the entertainment business in our country. People doing pay-per-view to watch things that we should not celebrate. I forget the estimate. It's a huge estimate of what percentage of the internet is porn and porn related. But it's huge. It's a huge percentage. People doing what they should not do with anonymity. They're in their own homes, so they're not going to get caught out publicly. They're not going to get killed for being an adulterer by somebody who caught them outside. But it's something that's destructive and does not belong in our lives. And we need to not go along with the crowd doing what the crowd does. Stealing and lying. Let's read Leviticus 19:11 following together. You must not steal. You must not lie or deceive one another. You must not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You must not defraud your neighbor or rob him. You must not withhold until morning the wages due a hired hand. Stealing and lying. And in our passage it simply says, you shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Theft and fraud. Whether it's stealing a package of meat at the grocery store for whatever reason, Ephesians 4:28 says, let him who steals steal no longer, but rather let him labor with his own hands so that he may have something to share with him who has need. Or whether it's fraud. And in the passage in Mark 10:19, when Jesus was talking to that rich young man, his commands that ended with honor your father and mother, he put in this passage from Leviticus 19 that we read. You shall not commit fraud. He was starting to prick at the man's conscience already. He was a rich young man who ultimately rejected Christ and chose his riches. And Jesus was beginning to kind of poke at him a little bit, adding in a command that wasn't in the original 10 Commandments, came a book later in Leviticus 19. But challenging him on that. And fraud is such a problem now. I remember when I first heard about identity theft, I thought it was a joke. And it's hard for you to believe that if you've lived with identity theft or you've known about it your whole life and all of that. But it was a newly invented thing that people came up with like 25 years ago or something like that. And now it's this huge deal that's costing people so much money and so many headaches trying to get their life straightened around again. And some people deciding that they're going to steal in this technological way so that they can be rich and others can be left poor. And maybe they don't care that others are left poor. Maybe they choose to seal off their hearts so they don't think about that. But stealing and lying, terrible sins. I like this. 2 things I can't stand. A liar, and then a liar who gets mad when you don't believe the lies they are telling you. I brought in vows here. Jesus does something similar in Mark chapter 5. We'll look at that in a second. But one of the things about vows, I notice that with kids on my school bus that I'm driving, they'll tell a lie, and then if somebody else doesn't believe the lie they tell, the first thing they do is make a vow. I swear to God. And I've gotten to where when I hear somebody say, I swear to God, what that means in my ears is this person is lying. Isn't that weird? It's gotten so perverse in our culture that somebody who's doing something they probably ought to do, which is to make a vow, but trying to show you that what they're saying is true, they're actually demonstrating that they've been telling a lie. Over in Matthew chapter 5, here's what Jesus says. It was said, verse 33, you shall not make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Proverbs 6:19. One of the 6 or 7 things that God says he hates in Proverbs 6 is somebody who tells lies. Amazing. God hates it, and yet it's full. It's so far in our culture, the lying and the vowing about the lying, that it really marks out people who have not surrendered their hearts and their lives to the Lord. So how are our hands? How are our mouths? Are we looking for things that we can put our hands on? Are we anxious to get what belongs to somebody else? And are our mouths saying things that should not be said? The next one is coveting. And this is the 10th of the 10 Commandments. You shall not covet. And I'm going to read it to you first in Deuteronomy 5. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house, his field, his male servant, his female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. You shall not covet. Romans 7:7 and following says, what then shall we say? Is the law sin? Certainly not. I would not have been mindful of sin if not for the law. For I would not have been aware of coveting if the law has not said, do not covet. But sin, seizing its opportunity through the commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. For apart from the law, sin is dead. So the commandment's a little tricky, right? And this is not God's fault, and it's not the law's fault. It's Satan's fault, ultimately, for being the tempter, for putting in our minds desires that should not be there. It's our own fault, giving opportunity through our own fleshly desires. But it's tricky because as we read the command, do not covet, sometimes there's a way in which it gets planted in us, oh, I should try that. You know, it's kind of like the don't think of pink elephants deal, and right away you start thinking about pink elephants, and you're trying hard not to. But it's a battle. And so Paul says something like that's true about the law. When it says do not covet, you start thinking, well, my neighbor's house is a lot nicer than mine. I kind of do want that. How come my neighbor's driving the next model of car, and I thought mine was pretty good until I saw his? Or how about my computer isn't as cool as theirs? Or I have this system and they have this system. And we just get coveting, we get desiring, we belong to other people. We're not allowed to do that. Greed is idolatry. Paul says that outright in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, at the end of the list of sins, he said, or greed, which is idolatry. Now, none of us would think about bowing down to a big statue, golden statue of money. None of us would think about doing that, but really, we do that every time we're greedy. We do that when we want more than what God has chosen to give to us. And interestingly, I was telling you about the rich young ruler and Jesus' conversation with him. He put in fraud, but he left out coveting in his conversation. And I think somebody who was really familiar with the law, as this young man was, would have noticed the insertion of one into the Ten Commandments and the deletion of another out of the Ten Commandments and say, why did Jesus do that? And what Jesus did for him, this is not true for everybody. I think what Jesus tends to do is put his finger on the area of your life that's an idol. And for this young man in Mark chapter 10, it was his money. And so Jesus said, one thing you lack. After the man said, I've kept all of these laws since my youth. He said, one thing you lack. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor and come and follow me. Well, the come and follow me part is how the man gets saved. It's not the by giving away money. But for that man, he was not able to follow Jesus while he was also bowing down to the idol of money. And it says that he went away sad because he had great wealth. And Jesus said how hard it is for the rich to inherit the kingdom of God. It's impossible, in fact, with man, but all things are possible with God. Greed is idolatry. Greed. The Black Friday, this is a joke ad, but come celebrate material obsession, idolatry, illusory wealth, greed, avarice, the things you own, owning you. Wow. Well, some other people, Jesus put his finger other places. The woman who'd been married 5 times and was living with the man at the time, he put his finger there and said, go bring your husband. She said, I have no husband. So you're right, you don't have a husband. You've had 5, and the one you're living with now is not your own. And just him knowing about that area of her life is what turned her heart to the Lord. And her whole village she told about. Come see a man who's told me everything I've ever done. Greed is idolatry. We're bowing down to wealth. And Jesus said you cannot serve both God and money. Contentment is the key. So this is the previous slide really to the one I showed you before about adultery and murder. This is where it started. Holding hands with your wife, walking through the park, see a pretty lady, and the wife goes ballistic on it. Goes swordistic on it. So contentment is the key. I want to read to you from 1 Timothy chapter 6. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. You guys ever think about that verse? Think, I'm warm, I've got a place to live, I've got clothes, I've got food. That's enough. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. That's about the love of money. But it can also be the love of somebody else's wife. The desire for somebody else's donkey or ox. The desire for somebody else's house. To say, I want somebody else's stuff. I'm not content with what I have. I want what other people have. Are we content? The passage closes off with the charge to listen and obey. Let's read John 14:21. Whoever has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and reveal myself to him. Fear helps. Back in our Deuteronomy passage, verse 29, God says, "Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it may be well with them and with their sons forever." Verse 27, the people say to Moses, "Go near and hear all that the Lord our God says. Then speak to us all that the Lord speaks to you, and we will hear and obey." Well, the fear helps. Oh, that they had such a heart to fear me and obey. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Romans chapter 3, verse 18, again, the last in a list of things that Paul says about the wicked. He says, and he's quoting from the Old Testament, "There is no fear of God before their eyes." Now, sometimes we get a mistaken idea about fear. We say all fear is bad, and there's all these songs on Christian radio these days about how fear is bad. You got to get rid of fear. Well, don't get rid of fear of God. Fear God. It's the beginning of wisdom. Do have the fear of God before your eyes. He's not a child's plaything. When Jesus was being crucified between two thieves, both at first were taunting him, "Save yourself and save us too." Finally, one of them got sick of it. Luke tells us that he says to his other thief, "Don't you fear God? We deserve this sentence of death, but this man has done nothing wrong." And then he turned to Jesus and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "I truly tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." What led to that? The fear of God. The fear of God led that man to rebuke the other thief and to appeal to Jesus for salvation. Don't toss away the fear of God. You need that. And the promise, again, is you prolong your days. I like how this promise isn't just tied only into honoring your parents, but obeying all the commands. Verse 33 in our passage says, "You shall walk in all the way which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live and it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you will possess." 1 Peter ties it in to a different topic. He says, "Let him who means to love life and see good days." How many of you want to love life and see good days? "Let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile." Ties into what we do with our mouths, ties into lying, ties into all of the commands. If we want to prolong our days, we need to walk in obedience. Do we fear God? The last 6 commands show us how to love our neighbors. Be countercultural, because our whole culture and really our whole world is running headlong in the other direction. Obey these commands. And from what you've heard today, what's one thing you see? And what's one thing that you'll do? I'd like to read to you again from Romans chapter 13, verse 8 to 10. Actually, it's on the screen, the first one. Be indebted to no one, except to love one another. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and any other commandments are summed up in this one decree: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. God bless you.